recording. Saint Ben. Yeah, I don't think there's any Saint Ben's. There probably, could be. This is, I don't even know what session I posted them. I think it's like 16 maybe. I think we might have skipped 10. I think 10 was actually a trivia night, but I think I misnumbered it. But I think this is session 16. And then we're looking at sort of the late 500s, so early 6th century, up to the Great Schism. And then next week we'll go, which is, sort of mid 11th century, so sort of 1050s, and then we'll look at the developments, and we'll end. So today we'll begin actually with the establishment of Benedictine spirituality, where we left off last week, and we'll carry on to the establishment of what's called Cistercian monasticism. And you can actually, if you have a keen eye to look at monasticism, you can see how monasticism moves throughout really about almost 1,200 years of the church, from the establishment of Benedictine monasticism in the 500s to all the way to the last sort of 1700s, the Trappist, or the last sort of major religious monastic movement, other than Taizé, which counts itself in the monastic tradition, but they aren't traditionally understood as monks. That's more of a newer expression of ecumenical community in the monastic tradition, even they themselves. But before I do that, Sharon, you were asking about last week about Constantinople and how it got its name, and I thought, hey, you know what? Let's just take a little excursion. And so, just to understand where it is, it's modern day Istanbul, so in Turkey, and it was the capital of the Roman and Byzantine Empire from 330. Now remember, 325 is Council of Nicaea, so it probably wasn't, and in fact it wasn't. It was in 324 that it was renamed. It was originally called Byzantium, and it was originally just the capital. I mean, it was a major power point in the East. In the development of Christianity, but when Constantine took over it, and because the Roman Empire spread that far, and that was still kind of, although we look at that somewhat kind of as Middle East. I mean, I don't know how you categorize Turkey. I mean, I guess it's kind of Middle East. It's more of Asia Minor, maybe, if you will. I mean, because it's not, when you think of modern day Europe, you don't think of Turkey, because we think of the EU, so sort of some of the Eastern countries west. But it became the capital of Rome and the Byzantine era, which was basically the Eastern Roman Empire, from 330 until 1453, and so then it was taken over by the Ottomans. But in 324, it went from Byzantium, which was thought to be, by Constantine, the establishment of the new Rome in the East. It was meant to be the new capital of all of the Roman Empire. It was a strong, bustling city, and so compared to Rome, it was, Rome was still sort of in that sort of temporal stage, or in that flux stage where it hadn't quite established itself. So it seemed like a better place to establish the new Roman capital of the new Roman Empire. The fall of Rome ended, as we talked about last week, ended the sort of Western Latin power, and then what fell and went underground and sort of was low key grew over the next 500 years, to the point that then as the West grew in strength and power, I guess it would be over here for you, the West grew in strength and power, which is and we'll talk about those elements that led up to this great split. So prior to 1054, which is what we're going on to, the East and the West kind of functioned in a fluid relationship, but the concentration of power was in the East for you, and then as the West grew, power really began. I think I said this during the summer series that I did church history. Power, I think, the power struggle ultimately is what broke them up. I don't think it was theological. I think there were cultural things that played into it. And I know that they blamed the filioque debate as the main split point. But I think fundamentally, in my perspective, it's power. I'll explain that as we go through.
Are you talking the Orthodox Church?
Between the Latin Church and the Eastern Church, or the Greek Church.
Well, when the fall of Rome happened in 452, all power shifted to Constantine.
100%, and he had already established, he was already in the process of establishing that without the knowledge that they were about to get sacked.
Right.
Well, I mean, not about to, but in the next 100 years they would get sacked, or 150 years they get sacked, so, or taken over. So his intention was to have it be the center of power. Now, in the East, they functioned with patriarchs. So they saw, and there was a sense of equity, that if they worked together and they were different parts of different regions, and then there was a council. And what you'll see over the next 500 years as the West redeveloped, they also redeveloped the position of the Pope and their understanding of the Pope, the papal ascendancy that goes back to Peter. As that has sort of become stronger and stronger, ultimately what happens is the Pope says, I'm first among equals. And that even then was okay for some of the patriarchs in the East. There would have been 5 of them at that time, and they would have been equal. But the papal authority, the Pope didn't want to be the first among equals. He wanted to have jurisdiction over everything. So it would go a 1-4 rather than a 5 inequality. It's a power struggle. Now, did the Pope do that with justification? I think there probably was some sense of, if the Pope ascendancy comes from Peter all the way up to the present Pope, and Jesus gave the keys to the kingdom, as we read in the passages on Sunday, to Peter and said, on this rock I'll build the church. Well, from the Western mindset, it's a development of Roman mindset from Constantine all the way up through just the spread of, what will go on in these 500 years, basically established that sense of right to the papacy, and that right to be the key figure. Because although the East discredits even to today, they acknowledge the authority of the Pope, but they don't see the Pope as being over. And so that's why they're established in their own. Whereas in the West, and when you see that Pope, that's Pope. The Catholic Church still believes that they are the true church, and that the Orthodox Church is sort of adjacent. And then the Protestant church is over here. So, anyway.
He's looking at it.
Of course I'm looking at you. From the 5th to the 13th century, Constantinople was the largest, wealthiest city in Europe. So, from the 5th to the 13th century. Basically until things like indulgences and paying for stuff, which we'll get into next week, get into that more so, when the church started building things, when they started building St. Peter's. In fact, one of the things we'll talk about is the church in Cluny, which is this little teeny town in France, Burgundy region of France, 5 miles from Thésée, actually. It was the largest cathedral in Europe until St. Peter's Basilica was built. And St. Peter's Basilica was built with, I don't want to say entirely crooked money, but I would say money that was sort of swindled from the Western Empire. And then I think it was in that period, if I had to, after that split, we'll get to it. The Latin Church had so much power by that time over the West that they could stand it. Had that split happened several hundred years earlier, it wouldn't have fared in the same way. It was because of the progress in the establishment of spirituality and the expansion of monasticism and the development of monastic centers and the preservation of culture and the redevelopment of culture and liturgy, things that changed and ultimately led to a bit of that split. Where I really want to start to do is where we left off last week, which is Saint Benedict, who's a very dear, I love Benedictine spirituality. Have any of you ever heard of the term Benedictine Oblate? Is that it? It's SBO, Saint Benedict Oblate. An oblation or a Benedictine oblate is, good morning or afternoon, it's a third order of monasticism. Mm-hmm. So when you think of monasticism, you have monks or brothers, and then you have sisters or nuns, nuns or sisters. So I guess monks and nuns would kind of be the counterparts. They both simplicity, both living in community, both living poverty, all those sort of things. And then you have brothers and sisters, which is probably more of a last 500 years sort of evolution, if you will. I think that, and really what distinguishes between a monk and a nun is they belong to an order. And today, everyone who is in who is in first order monasticism, which is a monk or a brother, second order monasticism, which is a nun or a sister, they will belong to a system. Now, Saint Benedict, and even today, Benedictine communities are not tied. They're a little more like Baptists. They're a confederation rather than they don't subscribe to one central location of Benedictine authority. They subscribe to Benedictine rule and Benedictine tradition and Benedictine spirituality, but each are established. Now, oftentimes people will associate Benedictine Benedictine monasteries with the Catholic Church. Benedict is not Catholic. Benedict predates the development of Catholicism. Predates it doesn't predate the Western or Latin Church, which was established in Constantine. So you have 150-ish years in there of the development of Constantinian Christianity, but remember, the Church is still one. And it wasn't until the Church splits and really Benedict becomes more, although Benedict is highly recognized in the East, Benedict is by and far the father of Western monasticism, not necessarily Eastern monasticism. But he was an Italian monk, and he was born in 480, so at the end of the 5th century. In 1964, he was named the patron saint of Europe, which amazes me because that's like the last century. Like you'd think they would have done that before that. But by all accounts, he was looked at as being on that level of sainthood, and many have referred to him even as a saint before that official designation.
Was there a pope back in there? Was there a Benedictine?
Sorry?
Was there a pope back then that was a Benedictine?
Gregory the Great, who we'll talk about in a second, who brought Benedictine spirituality to Western Europe.
Back in the 1950s.
Oh, could have been. I mean, long overdue if it wasn't official. It probably was considered, I think they probably referred to him as Saint Benedict long before it was official. There are lots of saints that sort of historically gained their sainthood, and the Church at some point rectifies that with an official whatever sanctioning they do.
So you said he's probably the father of
He is the father of Western monasticism.
Western monasticism.
And much of our spirituality was shaped by his thinking. Much of our understanding of the Church was shaped by his thinking. And so in a period of about 300 years where there wasn't a lot of centralized theology, we'll learn in a second, is Gregory the Great actually instituted that and put that out there. But before the Gregory the Great, who was born in 540, so this is, holy cow, 60 years, so Benedict was 60 years prior to Gregory the Great. But when Benedict was 14 years old in 494, when he was 14, he left Rome. So just thinking about this is Silas's age. He left Rome and he went to a cave outside of Rome, and for 3 years lived as a hermit. 3 years, so until he was the age of 17. And it was there that I had mentioned before that he realized in that time of isolation that he said, "Whose feet do I wash?" And that led him to realize that the monastic life, living by these rituals, was never meant to be lived in isolation, but to be lived in community. And although he wasn't the first to develop the notion of communal monastic living, it was a major shift in how the Church thought about monastic living. And you actually have a huge shift in this period from hermitages and isolated monastics into more communal expressions of monasticism. While he was there in that region, he was fed and cared for by Saint Roman, who was another hermit. But eventually, through this idea of Cenobitic monasticism, of communal monasticism, Benedict would found 12 communities in Subiaco, Subiaco, I don't know. And today, there is present day Luzano, which is about 40 miles east of Rome. Those communities can still be seen there. After developing those, he actually in 529, which he would have been 49 years old, so he spent a considerable time in amongst these 12 communities and established each of them. So in that period of from 17 to basically 49, he established in that region 12 communities. He eventually left those and established his forever community in Monte Cassino, which is in the mountains of central Italy. There he developed a community, and there he wrote this rule. A rule that is based on what was called the rule, the rule of the master. So there were a number of rules that came about. There was a rule in 292 to 348 called the rule of Pacimus. And then there was also in the early 6th century, there was something called the rule of the master. So Benedict was taking these two communal rules. One was the rule of Pacimus was very strict, required a lot. It wasn't gentle. It was like harsh sort of, if you do this, you got to live by this. We need it. The rule of the master was more of a theoretical or a theological. It sort of proposed some theology around living in community. And what Benedict did was he took the communal structure and softened it in the theology, embedded it, and he developed what is known as St. Benedict's rule, or the rule of St. Benedict, which has been the basis for every communal rule. Likely, I can't say one didn't go back to the rule of the master, but this rule has been the basis for monastic rules since, do you want to shut that one too? Since the history of, since St. Benedict came on the scene. It goes into how if you have to miss prayers, it goes into how chores are done, and it's always in consideration for others. So I studied this rule during my PhD pretty extensively. One of my comprehensive exams was on monasticism and the St. Benedict's rule, and it spread throughout. So if it's something that interests you, we can take a deeper dive into it some other time. But it's a great rule for living. It really sort of. But it's worthwhile digging around into it. So we don't have time for that today.
Training, I never heard of it.
So and so much of what we think depends on it actually. So the Lombards sacked Monte Cassino, and then the monks spread, and they never reestablished. So it seemed as if Benedict's rule and Benedict's spirituality was lost until Pope Gregory the Great, or Pope Greg, we'll call him. When Pope Greg, he was born in 540. And he died in 604, so he lived, I guess, 64 years. Probably the most significant pope of the medieval period. His decisions, his actions, what he did to begin the process of reestablishing Rome as a powerhouse in that era is unprecedented throughout Europe. Charlemagne, as the Holy Roman Empire, probably was the second most influential, but not in a spiritual or theological way. Somewhat quasi-spiritual, but much more in the sense of power. And it's that when you think of this power struggle between East and West, then when we get to next week when we get to the Crusades, you'll understand why the Crusades are such a nightmare, because it's it's the church doing all sorts of things to itself. So he's often known as Saint Gregory the Great. He was the 64th Bishop of Rome, i.e. the Pope. At age 30, he was a prefect of Rome, which is essentially an appointed position that gives him ultimate authority. It's kind of like if the Pope says, you're the next in charge. So he was kind of next in line for that ascendancy to move into that position, and that prepared him for that. He grew up in a noble home, was well educated, eventually turned a portion of his parents' estate into a Benedictine monastic community, hence the tie. So at age 30, he's overseeing Rome, but before that, he had sort of been trained in this monastic tradition. He was considered by many to be the most favorable pope of up to that point. Theodosius was a huge pope. He brought about the Holy Roman Empire. There were others that sort of stood out, but everything that those popes did ultimately was judged by the fact that Rome fell. If the popes prior to the fall of Rome were doing if they were doing a better job, the belief is Rome wouldn't have fallen. I mean, obviously, we talked about last week, they overextended themselves economically. They had small armies. They grabbed for too much, and they couldn't control it. Lots of board games about this same process. Overreaching. But he instituted the first administration to deal with public welfare. Maybe not the first, but the first widespread. And so actually was starting to make headway in improving the actual material welfare, not like necessarily money, but material welfare in the sense of those necessities that people had. During his time, he gained authority in Spain and France that had original sort of reach tentacles and the spread of the Roman Empire, but fell to other powers. Again, the small army theory that they just couldn't control those areas, so they fell to other authorities. But gained authority during his reign in both Spain and France. Also was responsible for sending missionaries to England. So up through France, then to England and the British Isles. And then from the British Isles, actually eventually would go to, by 590, which is, in 590, he sent missionaries from Britain to then, do missionary work in the Netherlands and Germany. So under his reign, he reclaimed Spain, France, Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany. So that, keep in mind, so those were the outliers of that main sort of, southern France, Alps, Italy region, and then to the east. So what he's doing is he's conquering west, and as an influence grows, this is actually what begins the rebuilding of the Roman Empire. He combated what was called the Donatist controversy, and which dealt with the sanctity of the priest or the presiding sort of religious official. The argument that had come up is that the purity of the individual, so my purity is what ultimately affects the efficaciousness of the sacraments, the preaching of the word, the ministry that the minister does. And so the Donatist controversy basically established the doctrine that God's sacraments, God's spirit moves from without, that the actual vessel itself can be a broken vessel. And they're taking things from Judaism. I mean, before the priest could enter the Holy of Holies, there was all sorts of rituals and rites they had to sort of go through before they could even enter into the sanctuary. So the idea was you had to purify yourself, you had to have your sins absolved, and then you could then do this holy work. And the Donatist controversy came as sort of a revival of that notion of that we need pure priests. Also a growing tension, as we'll see when we get to the Great Split, because in the East, you could be a priest or a religious leader and be married, but in the West, in Rome, they wanted them to be celibate, which has been the source of controversy leading all the way up to the Reformation and beyond, and still is one today.
You know why?
What's that?
Why they celibacy? It was because of inheritance. They were afraid of losing the churches to the wife if they were married.
Oh, see, there you go. And so what is that ultimately, I didn't know that. Yeah, there you go, bingo.
It is.
This is the story of human civilization. Power, and money is power, and influence is power. Lots of board games about this. Okay, so he wrote many things, but his probably most significant book or books was called the Dialogues. He wrote 4 books called the Dialogues. The first 3 dealt with miracles, signs, wonders, and healings. So bringing, miracles, signs, wonders, and healings. These are all supernatural realities. The last chapter dealt with the existence of invisible realities, the soul, and the afterlife. But what I'm trying to point to is that even in the 600s, Pope Gregory the Great had a robust understanding of the cosmology that said that spiritual beings and realities existed beyond. So oftentimes we look back at that period of the church and they're just doing their state things and they're doing their power things. But here's a pope who actually believes in the reality. Maybe the only pope in all of them. I'm just kidding. No, I'm sure there were lots of them. But believes in the reality. But those things are not what make the dialogues important. What makes the dialogues one of the most important documents of the early medieval period is because in the second chapter he offers the largest amount of information that we have about Saint Benedict. He basically wrote he loved Saint Benedict. He was a Benedictine, and he wanted to capture the story of Saint Benedict. So most of what we know, he took. And some say that it's not historically accurate, but he claims the sources that stories of Saint Benedict and writings of Saint, he sort of compiled, and so clearly Saint Benedict and Benedictine spirituality had a major impact on him. And I just realized I talked about oblates earlier, and I went back to that first order, second order, third order are secular oblates. These are. They originally developed in the notion of what are called confrates, and in monastic communities in this period in particular, as monastic communities were developed as centers of learning and centers of production. What we'll see from the period of the reestablishment of monasticism all the way up to really the development of the Cistercians was a gradual strengthening of power within monastic communities that were the sort of pinnacles or hotbeds for intellectual activity. And as they grew in their strength and power and influence, these monastic communities all over, nobility started sending their children because they wanted them to be educated, and it was the only place they would get an education, a theological education. And so what they did was they had these confrates go in and do the work of the community. They started doing the labor. You have smaller movements, but every monastic movement from the development of Benedictine spirituality, the Cistercians, the Trappists, and there are a few smaller ones, every monastic renewal movement is a return to labor. It's a return to ora et labora, prayer and labor. They have, through the history of monasticism, been seen as handmaidens. And what happens is, as these confrates, as these nobility are coming in to be trained, they're giving the labor to them so they can concentrate on prayer, because you can't not do that. But the theory is when you remove the labor, which is the handmaiden of prayer, then prayer becomes almost an isolated intellectual activity. And so when you have that, you have then you have more formal liturgies that will develop. And actually, during Gregory the Great's reign, you have essentially development of Roman Catholic liturgy. Prior to that, there was a lot of overlap. Well, Gregory the Great, one of the things that he does is, where did I put it? Probably getting ahead of myself. Where did I write it down? Maybe it's later in the, it might be on the next page. Well, I'll get to that in a second, because I know I wrote it down somewhere. In 579 to 586, he was the ambassador to Constantinople. And so remember, he's reestablishing Rome, but he's the ambassador to Constantinople. And this was before he was made Pope, I believe. Yeah, because he was Pope in 590. One of the other fun facts was that he also, in the Roman Empire, encouraged bathing.
Encouraged what?
Bathing.
Bless him.
bathing.
Thank
Yeah.
God. Return to the bath.
Rebuilding hence Roman baths and the restructuring of them. He also instituted that Jews should be protected and allowed to practice Judaism. This was a huge shift where Jews were still being discriminated against, and he thought, you know what, we're a Christian nation, but he recognized the connection to Judaism and said, let them practice. But he didn't say, well, we shouldn't proselytize them. He was a huge almsgiver. And felt like that the church was the steward, so had a very early church understanding that you give to the church. So during his time, there were, wealthy nobility that gave massive amounts to the church, and he redistributed it. At the time, there were over 18,000 square miles around Rome, many of them farms or seaside productions. And or seaside operations where they were fishing, and because the church owned them, because basically nobility would give property to the church, and they didn't have anything to do with it; it just sat there. Well, he started actually having them to produce, and then he developed one of the first production and sort of mass social welfare production and transportation systems. And basically, they were bringing from these exterior properties the produce in. And so during his time, grain, wine, cheese, meat, fish, and oil were known commodities were coming in from outside provinces so that people within Rome could eat. He would eat what?
Were the monasteries basically where scripture was kind of kept through all this time?
They came. Protestants. There were over 1,000 monastic communities by the time I think Charlemagne came into. So between the period of 600 and 800, you had. I think it was. Let me just see if those again. My dates are always. By 910, when the Cluny Abbey was established, there were over 1,000 monasteries and over 10,000 monks, and they all reported to Cluny. So they were regions, kind of like jurisdiction or districts, and then the nobility in that region would send theirs to them. They became spaces of learning, of education, of winemaking, of beer making, in fact, most of Western civilization was preserved by the monks.
But since most people were illiterate, were they in charge of keeping, like, the copies of?
Yes, I mean, they would have, everything would have been stored with them. And that's what made, there's a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization, and it goes back to the idea that during certain wars in caves and grottos, they basically stored documents. And so had they not done that, had the monastic influence of the last 1,500 years not been to preserve, protect, hide, we would not have our history. And we would see the world vastly different than the way we do now. We wouldn't even probably, had in all of the invasions, had they been successful in destroying everything, it could theoretically meant that the earliest quote unquote Bible that we had would come from the 13 to 1600s. And it could have been and it would have been maybe a reconstruction of, it would, want to talk about 90% accurate, we'd probably be down to 10, maybe more than that, hopefully. But what else? I thought it was interesting that one of the stories, and again, there's something called hagiography. For those of you online, welcome to. Hagiography is the fables or stories around saints of their feats. As much as I fully believe in miracles and everything that happened in the scriptures, I also understand how things are credited and I don't doubt the presence of miracles or signs or wonders whatsoever. But I also am realistic to say that many of the things that they say happened probably really didn't happen, or might not have happened.
You mean St. George didn't slay a dragon?
Yeah, there you go. Maybe a little bearded dragon.
Didn't go across
That's right.
the street on a door.
No, those sort of things. So, but the story is that Gregory the Great loved the poor so much that he wouldn't eat until he knew, I don't know what it was, there were so many people that he knew that the masses had been fed. He would eat then, and then once food was distributed, they had this huge family table and that they would eat at, and he would always invite 12 homeless, or I don't remember the term they used for them, homeless folks to his table.
We need
a modern, oh, no, trust me, there are actually books written on that theme, that say we need a second.
Now is kind of in the same general vicinity.
I have some of the same tendencies. No, I do. I resonate, as I was like, man, this guy's amazing. But no, there are actually many who have said that. That's not the first time. So
what an amazing man.
we're not.
Oh, wasn't that when the book took his
Oh, maybe. I mean, it could have been. I mean, there's been lots of Gregories, but
He's the 14th.
yeah. Anyway, so yes, no doubt, he brought welfare reforms. He also, so some of his revisions. He revised the pre-Tridentine Mass, which was what beat Constantine to that period. But that was, again, a Mass that was both East and West. So what you have is the first reform of what was considered a liturgy or a rite that everyone practiced, for the most part, in official areas. And now he's tinkering. He did some removing, he did some changing, he did adding, he did a few things. The notion of the Our Father being after, I don't remember what part it was, but he moved the Our Father from an earlier point to a later point, and that's currently wherever it is now in our present day, in the present day Catholic Mass. The reason the Our Father is where it is Gregory the Great. So just, think about the influence of 1,400 years of the church, and where in the liturgy, that the sacred liturgy of the Western Church, where the Our Father is placed is because this guy decided to move it. Because this guy.
That started the whole tradition, follows us today.
It is.
If you change one thing in the program, somebody's going to be upset. That's not how we always did it.
Trust me, I know that. All too well. Yeah.
Some people still went by last.
So he added to the Roman Mass, notably, he also established 9 Kyries, which are Kyrie eleison, Lord of mercy, that still are used in Mass today. So just, it baffles me when I just think about when at the right time, right place, and the maintenance of tradition, this guy's done that. He established Gregorian chants.
That's the Gregory.
This is the Gregory. So when you hear the term Gregorian chants, it's referring to an embellishment, like he understood the kingship of God or Jesus and internalized it so much that he felt like the church needed to be. And I think it's, again, looking back a little bit of that, maybe that ancient Israel sort of thinking, the notion of the Holy of Holies, like gold and embellishments. So basically, he took a time where they were trying to figure out, and then a dark time of the church of the fall of Rome, but basically brought in a fuller music. He brought in gold. He brought in embellishments. He brought in tapestries. So the churches moved from a place of no, actually, I take that back. No, am I conflating something? Hold on one second. I might be jumping ahead. Where's my thing then? Oh no, that was during the Cluning movement, but this set the stage for that. So he founded monasteries. He sent sent monks out. He supported this is still Gregory's Great, protection of the monasteries. He supported the abbot's autonomy. So when you think of local, regional, sort of authority, he established that. He had a great emphasis on communal living and prayer. He had a monastery on his parents' estate, so that was a very strong notion. So felt like people should be living in community. And remember, there were no monastic communities established at this point. This is the beginning of them. A strong emphasis on the monastic vows of simplicity, contemplation, prayer, silence, and scripture reading, or study of scripture. Hence what happened in I gotta spit out my gum. My gum has now lost all, it's dissolving in my mouth.
Gregory, that's the name.
That's what happens when you tuck it in your gum, when you start talking, and then you.
My grandson's name is Gregory Benedict.
Oh, that's, yeah, there you go. Someone
There's a
knew,
good reason.
someone knew something.
Sounds a little Catholic.
Yeah.
So the Gregory the Great lived until 604. So now we're looking at the 600, really up to the establishment of the Cluny Abbey, so about 900. This was a period of this sort of 300-year period was a massive period of growing in power. As these monastic communities were established, they then became Roman places of influence. So think of them as these little outposts throughout Europe where the seat in Rome could control what was going on. And that monastic expansion continued to grow stronger. In 622, the Arab or Islamic armies attacked the east in the Byzantine area. And this was probably the beginning of some of that fracture, because there was a beginning growing sort. And again, it's not like you could just send troops over. It was a large, military operation to send troops into welfare, or to support. And in 663, so 40 years after, the Synod of Whitby Abbey, the English Church aligned itself. By that time, the English Church was sort of formulating itself, but it aligned itself fully on with Rome. So it means from Italy all the way up to the British Isles, you had this sort of growing empire. And
Can you go back to 622, the Islamic?
that's when
attack
the Byzantine side, so the eastern side. And I probably added, the fact that the West wasn't necessarily, they were still in a rebuilding phase, so they weren't in a position where they could have supported them. But what I'm pointing to, I think, more is the weakening of the East as the West is growing. By the time the split was there, you had 5 leaders across Christendom, 1 in the West, Pope, and 4 in the East, which will be represented in the game that you play next week. By 732, at the Battle of Tours, that ended the Muslim expansion, and that ended the Muslim invasions for that period of history. Which gave rise to, again, continuing growth and strength, leading up to Pope Leo, I don't remember what, naming Charlemagne the Holy Roman Empire. And by this point, that naming and that strength was like a move of power. So this is 810, or around 800. The West had grown in strength, the East had become weak. And so you start to see this tinkering of power. The East holding on to their, the East holding on to their 4 patriarchs and the power they had after all these invasions. The West, having gone through their demise, they're now rebuilding, they're spreading, they're strengthening. There's development of monastic communities. And they do count 700 as the beginning of the monastic spread, or the monastic mission movement. 700 is kind of considered that official target date. And again, it wasn't something that they weren't doing this to gain power. They were doing it to, I guess they probably were doing it to gain power to some extent, but it is also with the notion of the spread of Christianity. I mean, under Gregory the Great, there was still that sense of spirituality, but then that spirituality, once you start to see you have control in areas, sometimes that control shifts.
Were they priests, or were they just monks?
Monks, the abbots were considered the sort of power positions.
Well, by that I'm saying, could they say the Mass?
What you understand as the Mass or the Roman canon would have been something that would have been done in the monasteries and in city churches. But yes, there were priests. You're saying if there were still priests, yes.
In the monastery?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I don't know the history of the nomenclature around how they distinguish between a monk and a priest, but most monks are considered ordained. Like if they're,
They could be ordained, but a priest is ordained to do the Eucharist.
I'm pretty sure monks are allowed to do the Eucharist. I don't think they held nowadays, probably it may be different, but back then, I don't think that they were like, you can, you can't. I mean, everything was controlled by the
In
monasteries.
the groups we work with, there was usually a priest who attended to those duties in the middle of the abbot,
Monster.
and the brothers didn't really, they didn't do that.
And I don't know, back then they might have, because they were considered, I mean, the abbot was still considered in that priestly role, but today, I mean, I was just thinking about it, in the Taizé community, the brothers, every day they celebrate the Catholic Mass, but it's the local priest who comes in and presides.
Right.
So today, probably not, but there's gotta still be a priest in monastic communities, because they're not taking the Eucharist.
Right.
So I don't know, to be honest with you, I
I
mean,
think it is. I think.
back then, though, I doubt that, I mean, I don't know, that'll be my question to discover next week, what's the difference between a priest and a monk in this period?
When an order becomes a problem, the first person you look at is who's a priest.
But in this time period, the monasteries were the center. It wasn't as if the monks reported the priest into a central area, the abbots were, and all abbots reported. And then in 1910, well, that leads us to Cluny. In 1910, Duke William I developed and built the Cluny Abbey. And the third version of it, or the third abbey, was the largest abbey in all of Europe until St. Peter's. In Rome, which have any of you been to St. Peter's in Rome? Yeah.
That's awesome.
If you ever get a chance,
Amazing.
it's
Not
just,
been there, but I've seen pictures.
and it's probably too late now, but if you, like I did, if you start at one point and you walk around the walls of the Vatican, then you can say you walked around an entire country.
It is the entire.
You know who's done that? This guy.
I dragged across the city.
Well, you know that, I went to a huge Catholic priest, at his mother's funeral, Catholic priest's mother's funeral. And there was at least 500 people there, and there was over 200 priests and nuns. But for the first time, I saw female monks in the same brown robes and so on. I didn't know that there were female monks.
There's not many female monks.
These,
They were,
They're
they
friars.
there were, no, they were probably sisters,
that have the same monk.
huh?
No,
They
they
probably
weren't
have a similar-
sisters, there's a.
Monastic order?
There's a monastic order of brothers, friars, something like that, and these were the female versions they
That's
were
my
sitting
understanding.
within.
I don't
They're
know.
not-
I've
they're
never
not
seen it.
nuns.
Monks are a term traditionally used just for the men.
Yeah.
So, what's that?
Monkettes.
Monkettes, sure.
Monkettes, yeah.
So,
You saw them.
Yes, we saw them.
You saw them.
but when Cluny was established in this church, the abbot of Cluny reported directly to the Pope, and all the other abbots reported to Cluny. So it's kind of like a modern day, like Canterbury. You know, there's a ranking, and so they were there. And it was at that time there were 1,000 monasteries and about 10,000 monks, and they all reported to Cluny.
Jason,
Yeah.
how much did the monks and their communities interact with common people?
Oh, significantly. I mean, you know, there was a concern for welfare. I kind of, in my head, I kind of view the monks as almost like adjacent or reminiscent to the feudal system. Or, you know, what is it, what's the French term? The responsibility of the noble? I don't remember the term for it, but
I can't remember.
yeah. That the monks were functioned in a place of nobility. They were educated, they were wealthy, they weren't, when you think of monasticism, that's not the monasticism of the Middle Ages. It was more like churches or religious communities established that then governed. When you think of monks today, like the Brothers of Taizé, simplicity, living off and doing their own thing, they were, because the whole church and the state were all the same. So they controlled under Gregory the Great, bringing up welfare. That sense of extension of welfare was a part of that Benedictine expression, and it would have raised so I mean, it was a good thing for Europe in the sense it's a state. It brought culture, it brought civilization, it brought art. And during this Clunic era from early 900s to really on, they brought about nicer and more expensive adornments. but because they had money and they were trained in crafts and skilled, and they were doing stained glass. And I didn't get enough. I ran out of time. This was something I wanted to go back and I did too. This is also the time where you see an increase of tapestries and stained glass windows, because as those centers became more important to the culture and the life, the idea was let's
Sculptures.
everything. I mean, like there was, but within the boundaries of the church, the idea was let's make it nice. Let's give our best. But this mentality, I think, seeds what eventually happens when they go to build St. Peter's of we need more money. I mean, St. Peter's is the most elaborate, probably one of the most elaborate buildings in all of the world. I mean, I can't even imagine.
I haven't seen the Taj Mahal, but I wondered.
I mean, the Taj Mahal probably rivals that.
But mostly, I mean, Taj Mahal is a tomb.
Yeah, a tomb for his wife,
So it's
yeah.
not the same, kind of.
Right, I just was trying to.
But just the
picture
architectural
the-
structure, in the
Yeah,
sense of-
yeah.
and maybe it costs the same amount. I mean, all of these great structures are in pyramid, everything's built on slave labor. I mean, you can't name, I mean, you can even say skyscrapers being built today are built on the backs of minimum wage workers. So,
Because they don't get paid.
great highways yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of things that, anyway, we don't want to go down that path. But the point is that between the 8 and the 900s, so you have Gregory the Great bringing more liturgy, enhancing music. You have this period then that spreads out, and then all of a sudden these centers become more important, and then as money comes in, because nobility and everyone's giving money to the church under this, all of a sudden what gets better? They have more money than they need to. Well, let's make everything better. That's why we have too much money in the church. We said, let's do a new paint job. I'm kidding. But when the money comes in, you take care of things, but then it got more and more elaborate. And so you start to see the West becoming more elaborate. They have different liturgy, they're gaining power, they're gaining influence, and in the meantime, you see the origin of everything in the East, in Constantinople, and the Eastern Church, looking at this all going on as they're being invaded, as they're struggling, saying, and so it doesn't surprise us at this point that the Pope, as everything's growing, says, I think I'm the best. Pride and sin.
But the tapestries and the stained glass windows were originally supposed to be a way to teach the illiterate laity the stories or the history of Christianity.
And that's not to say there weren't stained glass and these sort of things prior, and that was the one thing I wanted to look in, like the correlation between when were stained glasses considered normative for churches in Europe. Because original churches wouldn't have them. I mean, again, but that you also bring up the point of catechesis. How do we raise people? How do we teach them? But at this time, in this period, like educating the person in the home was not really the major priority. It was like, you just accept this as is, and if you don't, you're going to be killed as, a traitor to the Roman. I mean, yeah, who knows? But you didn't have a choice. That's just what it was.
When did excommunication?
Well, I'm sure it happened before that. I don't know. I haven't studied the history of excommunication, but one of the most notable excommunications or attempts comes what we're looking at now. And this is where we'll end. What's that? Yeah, I'm sure there will be. What is it? Here's the thing: is what are you excommunicating from? I'm sure there have always been disciplinary actions taken. Matthew 18, kicking someone out of the church, but the notion of an excommunication, I don't know. Another question, because there were excommunication was clearly present in the 11th century when the Great Schism happened, because that's what actually precipitated the move to the split. So it had to already have been a thing. I don't know when it was established. Oh yeah, to kick somebody out. And they weren't doing it with the casual commoner. They were doing it with, nobles and officials. And it was like, you would have been a pariah of society at that point if you couldn't. I'm sure no one's leaving at this moment, so we'll just carry on until the rain then. So, in the breakup of church time, Phyllis Tickle, I've talked about her before, there's a 500-year split. She considers Gregory the Great's presence and reinstitution of Christianity through Benedictine spirituality as the major break between the early church and the medieval church. Well, Tickle and others would also consider the Great Schism the break. Although we're still technically in the medieval period, it would break the early medieval period from the late medieval period. But it also marks a shift and a major change in the church, because what was considered loosely one church, after 1054 July, what date was it? July 16th, 1054, the church split. What led up to that? Well, in the centuries that are coming up to that, there was a huge linguistic challenge that grew as the Western church developed and expressed its liturgy in Latin. And the Eastern church is still doing their liturgy in Greek. There became an incongruent way for them to worship. Although there were Latin churches in Constantinople and Greek churches in Rome, though they were, they weren't the common sort of, it wasn't like they were doing it in both languages. So linguistically and culturally, you had a divide as Roman culture grew stronger. It used to be Greco-Roman, but as those cultures began to divide themselves against one another, you see a cultural linguistic sort of break. You see the political power, both ecclesially and in society, with the Western Pope saying, I'm going to be the first among the equals, and the Eastern Patriarch saying, I don't like that. So you have leading up to the schism, you have a struggle amongst that. The Pope wanted authority over all churches of the Holy Roman Empire, which would have included those in the East, and they're saying, no, like we're over these churches. You don't need to be over these churches. Liturgical, by that point, beginning with Gregory, all going up through Constantine, all the way to the churches, there were different rites and practices. For example, you could get married as a priest in the East, but you couldn't in the West. The East had a practice of using leavened bread. The West had a practice of using unleavened bread. And there was controversy over that, which they should. One of the biggest controversies, and ultimately what we name as being the major split, was theological. Talked about this many times before. Over the term filioque. It's spelled Filiqu. Fili meaning son, and I guess oque meaning and the. But the West, and here's what it really wasn't just the theological difference, is that the West took the Nicene Creed, so the Roman Church took the Nicene Creed and added the words and the Son without an ecumenical council. They've had all these ecumenical councils. By this point, they would have had 6 of the 7, where they made major decisions that we've talked about over the last few weeks about the doctrines of the church. And now the West is like, nope, we're just going to change it. This Nicene Creed, this established creed from 325, into different language. And the theologically, those in the East felt like the Holy Spirit comes from the Father, and in the West they were arguing it came from the Father and the Son, which we all say it comes from the Father and the Son because we're all from the West, but in the East they still hold some distinction that the Spirit is the Father's Spirit, not the Spirit of the Son.
When we say
Yeah, they make it.
when the East still holds that, what church is in the East?
Eastern Orthodox Church, Antiochian Orthodox Church, in Russian, every Polish area, anything that has Orthodox Church attached to it would fall into that. Okay, so we're going to end here, but the last thing, and then this is the bridge, Cistercian, so 1075, so this is 20 years after this break. The East and the West Church are splitting, dividing, and actually right after that happened. I didn't tell you that. I wrote that down. I didn't. It was. So what led to it was July 16, 1054. There was a papal bull from the West, from the Pope at the time, excommunicating, and he sent one of his officials, and he took this papal bull of excommunication, and he put it on the high altar of the Hagia Sophia cathedral, or whatever it was, structure. So this was the most holy place in Constantinople. So the Hagia Sophia, most people know it as a mosque today. When you see pictures of them gathering in those big, I believe that's in Hagia Sophia, where they gather around, and there's also one in Mecca. But it was established, Hagia Sophia was established as a Roman holy place in 360, and it maintained that until 453. But at that time, they throw this bull of excommunication against the Patriarch Michael Cyrilius, and then in response, he returns an excommunication bull, or I don't know, it's not papal, but basically excommunicates the Pope. So they both try to excommunicate one another. So this main patriarch and this others. Then Michael Cyrilius, or whatever his name is, he then closed all the Latin churches in Constantinople. So, I mean, this is a major fracture of the church over power more than theology, but it dramatically affects. So I have a professor, although many in the Roman Catholic Church would argue that it's always been there, but I have a professor that would say that the Western Roman Catholic Church that claimed that universal Catholicism is something that was established in this century. And that then, therefore, that the proper Roman Catholic Church that claimed to the Catholic being universal really didn't establish itself until this split. It was always there before that, maybe, but it wasn't official until the churches decided to go. Then you had the Eastern Church, and you officially had the Roman Catholic Western Latin Church. There have been many attempts to reconciliation on both sides. Both claim that they've sought out reconciliation. Even in the last century, there was like a statement by the Catholic Church and fellowship. But today, Catholics cannot take communion in the Orthodox Church, and Protestants can't take communion in the Catholic Church or in the Orthodox Church. And no one wants to take communion in the memorial churches. I'm just kidding.
Depends on the priest.
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
Some priests.
Yeah.
Well, and today, the Pope knows that Protestants take the Catholic Eucharist, but it's one of the few places in the world where the Vatican turns a blind eye, which is what makes it special.
a lot of things that are changing,
So right after this, 1075, you have a Benedictine monk by the name of Robert de Molsime. He sought out permission from Gregory VII to found a monastery, a Benedictine monastery in an area of France, just sort of in the Burgundy region, in a town. He was Robert of Molsime. Molsime was the town. He thought that the Catholic centers in the Holy Roman Empire had become too focused on secular affairs. They weren't doing labor. They had lost their path, lost their way. And so he got permission from the Pope to basically reestablish a community focused on prayer and labor. In 1098, so whatever is that, 13 years after, there were 21 monks who joined him in a new monastery. They established it south of Dijon in a city called, I don't know how to pronounce it, Citeaux, Situ, I don't know, which in Latin is Cisternium, and it's called the Situ Abbey, but the Cistercian order comes from that region because it's in this city named Citeaux. And so Cistercian, in the Cistercian order, who will talk about those who came out of that next week. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was a Cistercian, and was probably the main Cistercian. But it was a major shift in monasticism in the sense of the Cistercian movement will grow over the next few hundred years alongside the church. So as the church is growing Western church is growing in power, starts charging indulgences, starts becoming a little more corrupt by all accounts, the Cistercian movement is sort of maintaining Benedictine spirituality. And that's what I want you to see. This monastic movement has maintained history, tradition, culture, scholarship, all of these things. And even in this shift of East and West, right at the beginning of it, less than 20 years after this massive split, you have the recognition of a need to maintain the essence of Benedictine monasticism, or essence of spirituality, through the midst of what the next few hundred years will bring about in change. Now granted, because of my monastic studies, I slant this towards that monastic side, but as I look at church history, and many other historians will look at it, you can't underplay, you can't downplay the significance, the influence that monasticism has brought to us today. So, and there are many in our current era who will say, actually, it wasn't St. Gregor the Great. There's a play called Waiting for Godot in France, or in England. And I believe, if my memory, this is somewhere in the recesses of my brain, this just came to me. It wasn't that we need another St. Gregory, it was, or, Gregory the Great, it was that we need another St. Benedict. And at the end of that play, I think either someone said it about it or it's actually in there. I think it might be actually in there. The line says something to the effect of, we're not waiting for another Godot, we're waiting for another St. Benedict. So new monasticism has been a piece of, and we'll talk about that in a few weeks and as it came out, but in the last half century, there's been a new movement of new monastics, and I would place myself in that category. I have thought about becoming a Benedictine oblate. My dissertation actually suggested that Taizé, in order to sustain spiritual formation from the Taizé community, that they develop a system of oblates. The reason my dissertation is not published is because I have to take that whole part out, because the brothers do not want that in there. Because they don't want oblates. That's not the system they're working with. And I understand it, but oblates, monastics, Benedictine spirituality, this sense of movement back towards the basics of prayer and labor, honest work, honest prayer, go hand in hand, I think is a renewing theme of our current era. I think
there's a lot of young people who are thinking that. My son is one.
Yeah, you've talked about that. Since the turn of 2000, Gen Xers started pursuing historic expressions of the church, historic transcendent expressions of the church. And we've seen a growth in Benedictine monasticism and monastic connection since, like it's been we're in the largest period of Benedictine growth since probably one of these periods. So, and that's where we'll pick it up next week, Cistercian, and we'll take next week from Cistercian, the development of that, so the sort of the beginning of the 12th century, the beginning of the 1100s, all the way up to the Reformation. So what we're going to see next week is the development of scholasticism, the development of intellectualism, and how that spreads in conjunction with the printing press. And that what we have then is probably one of the few of the most dynamic centuries of the church.
Can we get an outline of what you're gonna be talking about? So we can learn how to.
We did that the first week, when we did that shelf thing.